the ability of Hipácia Association to enhance the dialogue between Italy and Portugal, also through the organization of this very interesting event involving professors from Italy and Portugal. I was thinking about now trying to recall the origin of the way that we have decided to choose together with Hipácia the title of this webinar, Migration Phenomena. I have to say that it happened to be very timing, the realization now of the conference, because it's something of the daily news. We are just confronting every day with the effect of this phenomena. It's not only applied to Italy and Portugal, which are one of the main contributors through their national community abroad, but also for what it implies in terms of political, social, economical consequence of the immigration flows coming from outside the border of the European Union. So it's proved to be a good choice to have this title, to have this subject, a topic that I'm sure that is going to be very interesting, not only for the experts who are going to participate to this discussion, and but also for those who are hopefully participating from outside without having such a strong background in knowledge in terms of historical appraisal and scientific approach to the phenomena. As we said, it's something that is affecting our normal life, and this is the reason why the subject is under the scrutiny of, it's one of the most important pillars of the action of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. And precisely in these days, in these weeks, the mediation, the effort of finding a solution to this very complex path that the European Union has been following in trying to manage when I mean manage, is managing the mechanism of migration, is entering into the very, very delicate phase. As you might be informed of, the European Union is discussing now also with an important role of the Portuguese presidents, the new pact on migration and asylum. Which is one of the priorities of the program of the Portuguese presidency. And also just connecting to what is the subject of discussion, I was quote, is doing so with the aim of establishing a common migration management mechanism that is effective, resilient, and reliable, and safeguards human rights based on the fair sharing of efforts and obligation. So by this sentence that I wanted just to highlight, it gives an idea of what are the implications of this management mechanism that the European Union is trying to find, to solve and to balance. And it's a matter of balancing, in fact, because you have to encompass the needs, the perception of all the actors involved under two perspectives. One is the internal dimension, and the other one is the external one, and both are decisive in terms of the possibility to get to the final solution of just setting the finest possible mechanism of managing these flows of immigration. The internal dimension is very complicated. It's the one that's related to the stand of member states within the border of the European Union. And there exists significant distance and even very strong vocal division between member states. Something that is not a secret, has to be hidden. And these divisions reflect different nuances of the approach that should prevail in dealing with the immigration pressure from outside the border of Europe, between solidarity or responsibility of the countries of first hospitality. So the research of an optimal balance between these two needs is precisely what the European Union is dealing with in these days, in these weeks. So this is the very important aspect, is the management of all the different sensitiveness within the border of the European Union among member states. Then there is the external dimension that is it's very relevant as well. It corresponds to all the very difficult, complicated mechanism of outreaching towards the countries of origin of the migrants and transit. Now, what is the idea that is prevailing in these days in order to get to the solution that hopefully will be reached in the next weeks, is that the approach towards the countries has to be managed in a way that the bilateral agreement will have to be sort of tailor-made. So, meaning that it has to include all the possible arrangements that contribute to the effective participation of those countries of origin to share the responsibility of their readmission and return policies of their migrants. This can be done through many instruments of relationship between countries, that is, such as visa, support to the economic system and development of the countries, fighting against unemployment, trade, cultural, like Erasmus style, so in a way of involving positively those countries. And this is because it's also in the guidelines that the European Union gave it to itself, that an effective and human return policy has to be an integral part of a comprehensive migration policy and does not contradict a more open migration policy. Ensuring the return of irregular migrants is essential to enhance the credibility of policies in the field of international protection and legal migration. So, as we can see, also from a diplomatic point of view, and possibly also from the point of view of all the non-experts that are participating to this webinar, it's a very difficult, interesting, and very challenging and present problem, the one of encompassing all the aspects that are involved in this negotiation process that is underway. So so again, by saying that it was very, very timing and right, the choice of the title of the topic, and also looking forward to my personal approach, curiosity on seeing what is going to be the way of just appraising all the phenomena under the historical, scientific, demographic, and legal aspect that is going to be go under scrutiny through the participation of the panelists that are going to take the floor later on. I hope that all the external participants will always keep in mind that the subject that we are discussing is something that is linked to, again, to the daily news that we are dealing with day by day. So it's a very important subject. It's something that has to be part of the curiosity of everybody to see what is going to be the way that the European Union is going to solve this negotiation process, always bearing in mind that the value and the need to preserve one of the cornerstones of our identity as a European Union has to end in always in the respect of the value that we have been preserving, reaching first through the process of integration, and then preserving in terms of freedom of movement, people, on goods, and respecting on human rights. Europe is what it is because its identity always been marked and enriched precisely by the coexistence of different culture and tradition, and by its extraordinary capacity of integration that, through tolerance, our people historically has always shown over the century. So I'm looking forward to hear on the discussion, and I give the floor to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this kind enlightening opening. So I would like to call right now Davide Accardi, who is the director of the Microscope Department of Champalimaud Institute and president of Hipácia. Davide.
Thank you very much, Emellin. Thank you, Ambassador, for your support. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emellin, for the introduction, for the kind introduction. So I'm Davide Accardi, I'm the president of Hipácia, who is the Association of Italian Researchers in Portugal. And Hipácia has lived a very sad moment recently, so I would like to spend a few words about this, because 2 days ago, one of the founder members of the association, Santino Di Berardino, who was an internationally highly recognized environmentalist, died. And so I would like to express, in the name of the entire association, our deepest condolences to the family. And I would like to remember something of Santino, so because he wrote me, so he was always a very strong and courageous man. And he wrote me in the last conversation that we had, it was like 1 week ago. He said, "I wish you success and I will always support Hipácia." And so thank you, Santino. Hipácia will always remember you. And then with this, so I would like to say, I would like to thank our speakers for accepting our invitations and for giving us the possibility to deepen our knowledge on this topic and our understanding, critical understanding of the causes and the relationship in this involved in the migration phenomena, right? Both from the genetic and evolutionary point of view, and from the historical and the social perspective. So I will not take more time. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hear your speeches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Davide. So let me also thank all the board of directors of the Hipácia Association and its respective members for allowing me now to moderate this interesting panel of today. And I'd like also to make a kind of introduction. Well, we have all heard that migration is part of the history of humanity. In my case, migration is part of my history and is present in my personal and professional life. Therefore, I reiterate my deep gratitude to the speakers for having accepted to participate in this event and sharing your profound knowledge on this topic also. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So, we have Professor Guido Barbujani, who has worked at the universities of Padua, State of New York, at Stony Brook, London Queen Mary, and Bologna, and is now professor of genetics at the University of Ferrara. His main fields of research are human genetic diversity and human evolutionary history, as inferred from modern and ancient DNA. And his today's presentation is entitled Migration in Europe and the European Skin Color. Professor Barbujani, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, you can.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay,
Perfect.
fantastic. Okay, first of all, thank you for this invitation. It's very interesting to be discussing with all of you. Two things before I start. First of all, the migrations I will be talking about took place through millions of years. So we are by no means talking about the recent aspects of the phenomenon. The second thing is that 15 minutes are not many to talk of all these things. So I will have to be highly schematic. And the first problem is where to start from, because we could be speaking of the phenomena occurring through many, many millennia. I decided to start with a sort of picture of how humankind was between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago. And the idea here is that people like us, with a skull like ours, was restricted to Africa, where you see Homo sapiens in orange. The other people here are reconstructions by hyper-realistic artists of the aspect of these other human forms that occupied Europe, Asia, and parts of the Southeast. And I won't spend many words about them, but the idea is that there was a very large diversity within the genus Homo. There were many different forms of Homo. Until 70,000 years ago, more or less, something happens. Homo sapiens gets out of Africa, probably in a series of waves. We don't know very much about that. And in a matter of a few thousand years, all other human forms disappear. Clearly, these other human forms did not disappear because we killed them one by one. I'm trying to change page, but it turns out to be difficult here. Just, okay. Okay, sorry. Around 70,000 years ago, we get out of Africa. We move east initially, and this is based on the fossils found, on archaeology, and now also on the study of our DNA. Some people then turned left towards Europe, which we reached about 45,000 years ago. Other people moved mostly along the coasts through Southern Asia, then Central Asia. Then they walked through to the Americas. And they walked because the sea level was lower at that time. And so it was possible to go there on foot. But it was by no means a simple operation, because it means that people could survive and make a living on ice and survive at extreme temperatures. Then in a very fast process, which we don't fully understand to now, people moved from Northern America to Southern America. It was a matter of 4,000 or 5,000 years, very, very fast. And instead it took longer to colonize the Pacific, because there you needed to have the technologies for navigation, and this took time to develop. But by 2,000 years ago, more or less, all of the world was occupied by people like us, and all the previous biodiversity had been eliminated. There was only one human species, ours, Homo sapiens. The process by which we replaced the Neanderthals in Europe is complicated, and there are still areas of disagreement among scientists. But basically, here you see in blue us, the arrows showing how people like us moved into Southern Asia and then west to Europe. The blue spots represent some archaeological sites in which people like us were found, the fossils, of course, of people like us, whereas the names and the black boxes represent the Neanderthals. So we coexisted with them for a while, and then in the end, the Neanderthal was gone, and there was only one human species in Europe. This was not the only migration, of course, and now we tend to recognize at least three major phenomena, which are represented here in this map. So the first dark green arrow you see 45,000 years ago, it shows of the first spread in Europe of people who we call hunter-gatherers because they could only collect food, they could not produce food. But starting from, I would say, 10,000 years ago, not 7,000 like in this map, a big change happened. People began to produce food by farming and by raising animals. And this led to a dramatic increase in the populations because there was more food. And there was a major migration from the Near East into Europe, represented by the light green arrow. And then later on, in the Bronze Age, some other people came in through Northern Asia into Central Europe. Now, these three colors, orange, blue, and green, represent different components of our DNA, which we can recognize. But let me make a few things clear first. 99.9%, in fact, of our DNA is identical in all humans. So our differences are concentrated in that small fraction, 1 part per 1,000. Still, there is enough diversity there to allow us to recognize the consequences of these migrations when we look at the genomes, which means the complex of the DNA contained within our cells. These bars represent, at the bottom, some ancient individuals whom we studied in Neolithic and Paleolithic times. Whereas the bars on the top, where you see the word modern, represent current populations. And for instance, if you go to the bottom, you will see that there is a lot of orange. The Neolithic people, the people who came in through the Near East and occupied Europe around 10,000 years ago, have some features in their DNA, which we represent here with orange bars. Whereas the people who came in from the Northeast are represented in green here. And if you look at the map of the European population now, you see that there are two gradients. Basically, populations from the south, Sardinians, Albanians, Italians. I'm sorry, there is no Portuguese here, but you can consider yourself as a sort of mixed with Spaniards. Have mostly an orange component. More than 50% of our DNA is derived from ancestors who 10,000 years ago were living in the Middle East and then moved in Neolithic times. Whereas especially in the north and also in Central Europe, there's a lot of green representing the consequences of the third migration, of the movement of people from Northern Asia into Northern and Central Europe. The blue areas represent the DNA transmitted to us by the first hunting-gathering populations who first colonized Europe. Of course, many things happened later, but we believe that these were the main processes, the main migration processes affecting the continent as a whole. There were many consequences I will not be talking about, but something has to do with our skin color. And let me say a few words about that. Of course, our skins have different colors, and this depends on the amount, on the concentration of some grains of pigment produced by cells called melanocytes. And this is a section of our skin. The melanocytes are at the bottom, and they produce these grains of a pigment called melanin. In fact, there are two melanins, and this image is here just to scare you. I don't expect you to understand it completely. It's just to show you that there's a large number of biochemical reactions leading to the production of two kinds of pigment. Eumelanin, which is sort of brownish, and pheomelanin, which is sort of yellowish. Our skin color depends on the relative percentage of the two melanins, and of course also on environmental factor, because as everybody knows, if we stay in the sun, our skin color gets, well, first red and then darker. It's very, very important to stress the role of one of these proteins. It's called MC1R. Because if this protein is produced by our cells, then the pigment is also produced. Whereas if this protein is not produced, we don't produce any pigment. Now, our skin doesn't leave any fossils. So we don't have the skins of our ancestors. But the greatest expert in this field, Nina Jablonski, who works in California, proposed a model which is still very, very valid, I think. The idea is that if you follow the evolution of human skin colors through million years, at the beginning, some 7 million years ago, our body was entirely covered with hair. And if you open a chimpanzee or a gorilla hair, and you look at the skin underneath, this skin is white. So initially our skin was white, but through the million years we lost our hair coverage, more or less completely, depending also on individual variation. And in parallel, in Africa, where we evolved, the skin color became darker and darker. Now, if we focus on the last phase of this process, perhaps you cannot read the numbers here, but the idea is that at a certain moment from Africa, someone gets out. These are the ancestors of Neanderthals. And Neanderthals, as you see, have a light skin color. Whereas later on, some 70,000 years ago, people like us left Africa, dispersed over Europe and Asia. And according to Nina Jablonski's estimates, some 50,000 years ago, the color becomes light. This was proposed before we had enough technologies, enough data on ancient genomes to be able to predict the skin color. But now we can do it. We have some expert systems, some mechanisms related with artificial intelligence that allow us, with a good approximation, to infer the skin color from the DNA, including the DNA found in fossil bones. So the first finding was that Neanderthals, whom you see here in these reconstructions by two Dutch artists, Neanderthals missed the MC1R protein we were talking about a few minutes ago. So Neanderthals most likely had light skin, blue eyes, and sort of reddish hair. Then we continued analyzing the DNAs to figure out the skin color of the people who lived in Europe before us. And we found something surprising. This is something that made big headlines in the newspapers. You see at the bottom a skull of someone who was killed violently. And his skeleton was found in a place called Cheddar, like the cheese in England, and dated at 10,000 years ago. And at the top, you see the two Dutch artists, they are twins, Adrie and Alphonse Kennis, who reconstructed his aspect with the typical technologies of the police. Well, from this person's DNA, we could tell with 96% of probability that this man, the Cheddar man, had very dark skin, as you see, and blue eyes. A combination which now is uncommon, but that in fact was not a complete novelty, because at that time, this was 2 years ago, we had data on at least 5 European people who lived in Mesolithic times, so before the spread of agriculture from the east. And all of these 5 people had dark skin. And when I say dark, I mean very dark, darker than you see in this image, in fact. And 4 out of 5 had also blue eyes. So it was not 50,000 years ago that the Europeans turned to light skins, but 5,700 years ago in Denmark was a girl or a lady whose skin was dark and whose eyes were blue. And we know it not because we found the bones of this lady, that was also extraordinary, but because we found a sort of prehistorical chewing gum that you see here. And in this chewing gum, we found the DNA showing that this lady or girl had eaten hazelnuts before putting this chewing gum in her mouth. And she also left the traces of her DNA, which were sufficient for us to tell that her skin was dark. So the picture we can have at this moment is more or less like this one. At the bottom, you see a sort of a timeline. And I would like you to notice that the first event is very distant from the others. The first event is the first colonization of Europe by Homo sapiens 45,000 years ago. And these people had very dark skin. They established all over Europe, including Iberia. Sorry. And we have proof that in Iberia, in a place called La Braña in Spain, 8,000 years ago, the skins were dark. Then it was migration that brought in light skin colors in Europe. A migratory phenomenon that happened in Neolithic times, because in Neolithic times, in the Near East, we have the first instances of light skins. There was a phase of coexistence among these people, but then later on, people moved in through the East, and especially in the north of Europe, lighter skin colors were established. So the general idea that the Europeans are those with light skin should be at least in part modified. Now we do, but until 5,700 years ago, we didn't. And of course, then, migration continued, and I will stop here because it's no longer my business to speak of contemporary migration. As the ambassador said earlier on, one of the tasks that we have as Europeans is to allow free movement of people. That's one of the basic rights of humans in contemporary Europe. So I can only conclude wishing to the people who move around a happy and safe journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially with this. And I think right now we know much more about genetics, what's quite interesting. Thank you very much. I would like just to make a question, if I may. So from a genetic point of view, is the change of skin color influence or is related to the change in language? And if positive, how it could be?
Well, I'm not the best expert to reply. Certainly, if you speak with linguists, they would say that language change, as we can see it now, as you can document it now, is a relatively recent phenomenon. They don't go more than 6,000 years back in reconstructing the origin of languages in Europe. I think it was independent in that the genes for skin color are completely different from the genes regulating our ability to speak. But of course, everything that happened in our migration history had a consequence not only on our genes, but also on our culture, because the contact that we established led both to a genetic admixture, but also to cultural exchanges. And at the same time, in isolation, people developed special, particular biological features, but at the same time, their languages and their culture diverged. And so, the processes by which genes and languages evolve are, I wouldn't say similar, they are certainly, to a certain extent, correlated.
Perfect. Thank you very much. You have more questions, but you led to the Q&A time, but thank you. So let me invite our next speaker. Right now, I would like to call Professor Pedro Góis, who is Professor in Sociology and Methodology at the Faculty of Economics, University of Coimbra, and a researcher at the Center for Social Studies, SEJ. Undergraduate degree in Sociology, Master's and PhD in Sociology. He is an expert in sociology of migration and quantitative methodologies. His most recent research-driven, this technological things. Sorry, I'm blocked. So I would like just to give the floor to Professor Pedro Góis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen, for the presentation. It's very generous of you to let me participate in this debate, and let me just starting to say that I've already learned a lot with our colleague Barbujani. So I was worried because I was decided to start my presentation talking about migration from 16th century, but now I don't feel an historian anymore. So it's the sociology of the present compared to what you've presented. So my presentation, let me see if I can, this one. My presentation will deal with Portuguese immigration to Portugal, and then I will have some concluding remarks. And I decided to have this vision from the 16th century because Portugal has normally been associated more to emigration, out-migration than to immigration. So Portugal is a country of immigration, although in the last decades it has become also a country of immigrants. As soon as the 16th century, when the discovery of gold in Minas Gerais in Brazil led to the first Portuguese mass migration. So the exodus of migration, mainly from the northern part of Portugal, was so intense that the Portuguese state enacted several laws to hinder immigration to Brazil. At the beginning of the 16th century, fewer than 200,000 non-indigenous persons lived in Brazil. But after the gold and diamond rush in the end of the 18th century, Brazilian population was estimated to be between 1.9 and 2.8 millions, including, of course, a large number of forced migrants and African slaves. When the gold and diamonds disappear, migrations also start to disappear. And by the end of the 18th century, annual departures to Brazil were around 3,000. And during the first half of the 19th century, the number was only slightly higher to 5,000 people a year. After the slave traffic was banned, Brazil faced a growing demand for manpower, particularly after the mid-19th century. And this is forced employers to look to other sources of unskilled workers. Portuguese migrants were among those willing to take up both the jobs in the agricultural sector left vacant by the lack of slaves and the labor opportunities that were available in the commercial sector. Brazil, just you to know, gained independence in 1822, so almost 2 centuries ago. Who were those migrants arriving after this moment to Brazil? By the late 19th and early 20th century, Portugal began to integrate into the wider population movement that were directed from the old to the new world. And if you look to this chart, you will recognize that the Italians, the orange area, were during the first decades, the last decades of the 19th century, more numerous than the Portuguese arriving to Brazil. And only after the First Republic in Portugal, so 1910, the Portuguese became more numerous than the Italians. And you will see that the Italians have this constant presence in the migration flow to Brazil. You see the orange still very recently. And also the Portuguese have the same pattern, being more numerous in certain years, but being less numerous in other decades. During this first migratory cycle, that lasted until the early 16th, Portuguese mainland immigration was almost always synonymous with the immigration to Brazil. From 1891 to 1949, this country absorbed about 73% of the Portuguese immigrants, so more than 1,100,000 individuals. And even after in the 50s, 65% or more than 240 individuals left Portugal to Brazil. Another destination of Portuguese immigration during this period, mainly from the Azores, was the United States. And there are also small numbers of Portuguese for heading for new overseas destinations such as Hawaii, Venezuela, and British Guiana, and those left Madeira to go to these destinations. So from Portugal mainland, mostly to Brazil, from Azores, mostly to North America, and from Madeira to Hawaii, Venezuela, and British Guiana. The demographic and socio-economic characteristics of those who left the country can be summarized as follows. They were male, aged between 20 and 40, mainly from the agriculture sector and largely from the provinces in Portugal of Minho, Beira Alta, and Trás-os-Montes, and also, as I said, from Azores in Madeira. After the turn of the 19th century and during most of the 20th century, immigration to other countries coexisted with this flow to Brazil. Of course, there was a colonial migration from Portugal mainland to certain countries in Africa, mostly Angola and Mozambique. But those numbers accounted only for 4.7% of the Portuguese legal immigrants. So a big number of migration to Brazil, a very small number going to former colonies. From 37 to 74, the movement between Portugal and its African provinces registered almost 260,000 migrants at an annual average of around 7,000. There was also some movement towards other distant colonial locations, such as India, Macau, and Timor-Leste. But since the 50s, those numbers were in fact negatives because of the occupation, first because of the Japanese occupation of East Timor, and then to the independence of Goa, Damau, and Dio in India. There were no more Portuguese going to those destinations. If you look to the long graph on this migration still very recently, and I will show you the last period, you see that my out-migration was almost always positive with some peaks in time. The first ones were towards Brazil, and then after the 60s, we have a different cycle of intra-European migration, and most of the Portuguese directed immigration to France and to Germany. After, so between 55 and 74, most of the Portuguese migrants, they went to France and to Germany, which accounted for 84.5% of the migration, and or 18.1% when we are talking about Germany, a total of more than 1 million immigrants in this small period. In the years after, the 70s, there was a decrease in the Portuguese out-migration, but as early as in the 80s, a new destination country for Portuguese immigration arose, Switzerland. The intensity of flow to this new destination and the stagnation of flows for former destinations ensured that this new migration stream rapidly took place previously occupied by France. So between 1980 and 1999, almost 200,000 Portuguese immigrated to Switzerland. Well, I've chosen Brazil, Switzerland, and I will show you immediately why I've chosen these two countries where the Portuguese migration coexisted with the Italian out-migration in the same period. So, since that, another migration phenomenon occurred. So immigration. So I've just talked about out-migration. Let me now turn to immigration to Portugal. The values are not equivalent. The numbers are really different. But what we realize is in the end of the 19th century, we had a small amount of immigrants in Portugal. And these numbers stay very low, lower than 1% of the total population till the 90s. And only in the 90s, some 30 years ago, this started to change. So until 40 years ago, Portugal was a country of emigration. with a lot of immigrants and a very slow movement of internalizing migration. A sizable number of foreigners resident in Portugal only started in the end of the 90s, where we start to receive migrants not only from the past colonies, so Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and some others, but from different parts of the world, with a peak in 2000 and between 2000 and 2004, corresponding to the entrance of Eastern European migrants that peaked the number to 4.2% of the total of Portuguese immigration. And in these moments, so around 2000, Portugal became a distinct actor in this migration global system. So attracting not only migrants from former colonies, but migrants from different countries in the world. This number declined recently because of the economic crisis. So after 2008, the number of immigrants in Portugal started to decline again. And at the same time, Portuguese immigrants started to rise again. So there was a huge flow of new migrants leaving the country. And very, very recently, after 2015, the number of migrants start grow again. So what can we say about this global evolution? If you look to this chart from the CEF statistics, you will see that the numbers starting in the 80s were very low, and then they never stopped rising. Well, there were some declining numbers in the early years of this decade, but then it rose again, and we have now the peak of migrants in Portugal ever. So it's like 800,000 foreign-born nationals living in Portugal. And so I arrived to the recent data that I'm showing in here. So in the 16th century, Portuguese left to Brazil. And they had this movement of going in millions to Brazil. And at the same time, the Italians were our companions of this migration trip. And now we realize that one of the biggest movements of immigrants coming to Portugal are the Brazilians. And if you look, well, we have some former colonies like Cape Verde, some former migrations like the Ukrainians, some intra-European migration like Romanians, the British that live in the sun belt of the south of Europe, then Chinese, because the Chinese are migrating everywhere. But then the big numbers are Italy. So 25,000 Italians immigrants in Portugal. Who are those migrants? Well, in fact, some of those could be, some of the Italians could be part of the Brazilian migrants. And some of the Brazilians, well, if they get citizenship, they will move to the Italian colony in the next couple of years. So these Brazilians and the Italians, they seem to be connected. And indeed, they are connected because of the out-migration history of both Portuguese and the Italians to Brazil. So when you look to the rose numbers of the Italian migrants in Portugal, some of them are descendants of the former Italian migrants to Brazil last century, early last century, or even in the 60s. What are the demographic relations with those migrants that I have spoke previously? Well, the definition was they were mostly male, aged between 20 and 40, and mainly from the agricultural sector. So let's look to the graph. Well, they are not, the overwhelming majority, it's not male oriented anymore. They are men and women, but they are in the same groups of age. They are coming in the same groups of age. So what we can call the migration age is they after 20s until 45. That is the moment to migrate. That was the moment to migrate in the past. That is the moment to migrate right now. And if you look to the effect of all this in the Portuguese population, and if you take this long run, you see the Portuguese population, it's declining since the early 60s, with some peaks that were introduced by migration. So this big peak in the 74 to 76, it's the result of the returnees from the colonies. Then all the lines above the blue line are the result of migration in recent years. Then very, very recently, we had the result of out-migration. So there is a population leaving the country, and we are not receiving a migration from abroad enough. And then in very, very recent years, it starts to rise again. So the effect of the migrants in our demography, it's very visible in this chart with these 50 years. Let me conclude. What is different now? Well, Portuguese out-migration didn't disappear. It's still present, but it's diversified in relation to the past. There is not only Brazil now. There is a global migration leaving Portugal to different destinations. Motivations and projects are also different from they were in the past. We have more diverse migration in terms of education. So there's all groups of education are leaving the countries. And so less qualified, more qualified, less educated, more educated. And we are always thinking about the traditional Portuguese migration and the coexistence of this new migration with educated people side by side with non-educated people. Well, very similar to what is happening now in Italy. And what is the concluding remark for migrations to Portugal? Well, they don't come from former colonies anymore, because there is this diversity of migration. And Portugal, it's not the periphery sending only migrants, but it's not the center receiving only migrants. It's in the between. So it's in between to be a periphery and to be a center. And of course, it's a very complex phenomenon, because the cycles of out-migration and in-migration are becoming shorter. So when you look to the past, you see from the 18th century to 1960 is one cycle, and then from 1960 till now, we had already to add 3 or 4 different cycles of immigration and out-migration. So the migration movements have complexified and accelerated, and that's a good moment to stop and to discuss it later with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pedro Góis. How interesting presentation. Thank you. I also have a question, if I may. So I'd like to ask you, as usual, the Italian community right now is on the top end in numbers of nationals living in Portugal. So through a sociological perspective, do you think this could influence the Portuguese immigration towards Italy?
Well, depends. It depends. I think the numbers of the Portuguese out-migration towards Italy are still very small, but they are increasing, and they are economically driven. So when the economic situation in Italy will improve, some of the migrants that are currently in Portugal will move to Italy. Some will be Portuguese, some will be Italians, some will be Brazilians. So we can foresee in the future that some of the Brazilians that are living in this moment in Portugal will move inside Europe, either with the Portuguese citizenship, with Italian passport, or with the Brazilian one. So it's possible for us to foresee that this will be a dynamic movement in the near future. What I think is very interesting is the numbers of the potential migrants from Brazil to Portugal or Italy. Because when you look to the charts and you see that all those millions of migrants that arrived in Brazil in early 20th century, they have descendants that can claim for a Portuguese or Italian passport, sometimes both. And so the numbers of the potential migrants to Portugal, to Italy, to Spain, to Germany are really huge. And they are entitled, they have all the rights to come, but we must be prepared to deal with this migration that will be invisible, not in the statistics, and will complexify a little bit more our portrait of migration in Portugal right now. Thank you.
Thank you for this complete answer. Thank you very much. So let's go to our next speaker. So right now I'd like to call Professor Michele Colucci, who has been a researcher since 2011 at the National Research Council Institute for Mediterranean Society Studies. He has taught contemporary history and history of contemporary Europe at the University of Tucia and at the University L'Orientale in Naples. He is a member of the doctoral board in historical sciences and cultural heritage at the University of Tucia. He lectures at master's degree courses and higher education courses. And his presentation is entitled Italian History, a Mosaic of Migrations. Professor Colucci, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you for your invitation. In Italy, like in Portugal, we have to approach immigration, return migrations, and internal migration together. I think that it is necessary to frame those phenomena together, as for a long time they have been treated separately. And I begin from post-war Italy. One moment. Okay. In 1945, Italy was upset from a social and economic point of view. One of the biggest problems was unemployment, which pushed the millions of people to emigrate. Immigration had been a pattern chosen by millions of people from Italy since the end of the 19th century. The occasion for immigration arose not only from Italian conditions in post-war period, but also from the needs of post-war reconstructions. Many countries, especially in Europe, lacked manpower. The destruction of Second World War deep a crisis in the relationship between population, economic needs, and manpower. The war had in fact caused many victims among the active generation of working age. For this reason, recourse to immigration was immediate and great demand. But European countries created a very rigid system of migratory policy linked to a temporary presence of workers from abroad. You can see Italian immigration and Italian immigration by origins of departure. Immigration developed mainly to Europe, especially in Switzerland, France, West Germany, Belgium, and United Kingdom. Outside Europe, the most important flows directed to Argentina, Canada, Brazil, like Pedro Góis relation, and Venezuela. At the end of the 50s, the flow of immigrants decreased as international requests began to drop. In Italy, especially in the northwest of Italy, new occupational prospects opened up. This is the economic miracle. the flow of immigrants, especially from the south of Italy, began to move more and more frequently to the center Italy and northern Italy. In this slide, you can see internal migration in Italy, especially in the period from 1945 and the 60s and the 70s. Emigration from the south to the center north became relevant since mid-50s. The large industrial areas and large cities attract people from the south. And the phenomenon became rampant in the course of the 60s. The growth of the flows is driven by the manufacturing industry that, above all in the Italy Northwest, reached productive levels never recorded in the past. It is estimated that between 1951 and 1971, about 9 million of people in Italy changed their place of residence, an exceptional reshuffling destined to bring together different populations. Especially in the Northwest, internal migrations made a strong contribution to the thrust of workers' mobilization. The cycle of initiatives which took place, for example, in Turin, in Milan, and Genoa in the second half of the 60s would have been unbelievable without the participation of a young immigrant working class. This is a very big transformation period in Italy in the 50s and 60s. But in this period, there is also European integration. That's it. It's very important in European history and in Italian history. Since after the Second World War, relations between the European countries have been activated with the aim of sharing a common policy on population movement. The first attempt was made in 1951 with the signing of the European Coal and Steel Community, which provided for the free movement of skilled workers among the signatory countries. Compared to the past, this is a very important step. The treaty is signed by France, Italy, Federal Germany, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. In 1957, the signing of the Treaties of Rome marks a no-returning point because this is the beginning of European Economic Community. Italy, France, Belgium, Holland, Federal Germany, and Luxembourg signed the beginning of the integration process, which includes, for the first time, the free movements of labor. Then, in 1985, we know that Schengen Convention is a new turning point, but Italy signs the Schengen Convention only in 1990. In the 70s, there is the economic crisis, international economic crisis, and this is a turning point about migratory balance. The oil crisis in 1973 put the European economy to the test. The growth model that emerged since 1945, which had guaranteed development and well-being, went into a crisis. The exceptional economic expansion that began in 50s and 60s was stopped. Foreign immigrants, including Italians, were among the first to pay the price of the crisis. A chain of workers' repatriations and layoffs begins, especially from Germany and Switzerland. In 1973, for the first time in a long time, Italy experienced a reversal of the migratory balance. In that year, the balance was positive. The number of returns exceeds the departures. A new cycle in the history of Italian migration took place. The weight of immigration gradually began to decline. However, this is not a painless change. It is closely linked to the consequences of the crisis, and their return sometimes takes on dramatic connotations. In fact, the return is not always the effect of a voluntary choice, but rather to a choice dictated by the economic situation. At the same time, internal migration in the northwest area is no longer as easy in the past, but flows towards to the center of the country and the northeast, and are becoming more significant in this area. In spite of the crisis, this is a very important point, remittance do not stop, and after a small setback, they continue to increase. The remittance history is a fundamental point for history of Italian immigration. The new capital arriving will be decisive for the growth which will take place in Italy during the 80s. But immigration is a new issue in Italy in 60s and in the 70s. Foreign immigration in Italy as the first turning point at the end of the 60s, when more workers interested in entering Italy took shape. Until then, Southern Europe had been excluded from the arrival of non-European workers from extra-European countries. In Italy, foreign immigration developed without a legislative framework. The first law, limited to the labor, arrived only in 1986, a law called Foschi law. This situation favored the lack of protection and the precariousness of the world of immigration. Particularly penalizing are also in Italy, in the history, the restrictions to the right to asylum. In spite of the Italian constitution, in this first phase, the geographical reserve remained in force until 1990, which limited political asylum only to refugees from Eastern Europe. This is the period of Cold War. All those who left their own countries for political reasons or racial or religious persecution could not apply for asylum in Italy unless they came from Europe, from East Europe. In 1989, the murder of Jerry Maslow shocked Italy. Maslow was a South African immigrant who had fled because of apartheid. Due to restrictions on asylum, he could not apply for refugee status. It is important to remember the context in which he was killed. The rural area of Villa Iterno in south of Italy, in the province of Caserta. It is in fact an area that during the 80s had known the development of intensive cultivation of tomatoes, which attracted every summer thousands and thousands of workers, many of them of foreign origin. At the base of the context in which Maslow was killed, there is therefore the condition of exploitation in the fields and the racism, which are in a unique combination. The murder of Maslow in 1989 caused the protests in the world of foreign immigration and in many solidarity associations. And in 1990, an organic law was finally approved, the Martelli Law. Starting in 1989, many transformations took place rapidly, also on an international level. The fall of the Berlin Wall opened the way for immigration from Eastern Europe, which changed the framework of flows at the global level. Until that moment, Italy had received immigrants primarily from Asia and Africa. The end of the Iron Curtain brought about a major change, opening a new and disruptive season. In just a few years, migrants of Eastern European origin would leap to the top of the immigration charts in Western Europe, including Italy. The first evident impact of the new migration in Italy occurred in 1991 with the landing of Albanians on the coast of Puglia. Another particularly delicate moment having to do with the crisis in Eastern Europe coincides with the outbreak of war in Yugoslavia. In this slide, you can see immigrants resident in years, in the recent years, and labor permit in recent years. The global economic crisis that opened in 2008 ushered in a transitional phase for immigration in Italy, a complex process destined to profoundly change the migratory concept due to its indissoluble intertwining with the rapid and swirling changes in international migratory flows caused by the conflicts in the Middle East and in North Africa. Since 2010, the effects of the economic crisis are flanked by the consequence of another global crisis, the Arab Springs, which in a few years upset the balance in the Middle East and in several Mediterranean countries. The wars and the refugee flows caused by the new conflicts have a very strong effect on Italy. The immigration of asylum seekers increases. What is the situation today? Today, after years of substantially stable trend, departures from Italy to foreign countries increased after 2008, following the global economic crisis and the increase in Italian unemployment. It is enough to look at the data of AIRE that I know Hipácia knows, because it's the registry of Italians residing abroad, and we can understand the phenomenon. In 2006, there were just over 3 million of Italians in this register, which in 2020 will have become about 5.5 million, a very, very big growth. At the basis of this substantial growth is the assumption of the law of immigration, but of the flow of immigration, but also the law. We should not underestimate the law of 1992 on citizenship, which simplified the possibility of accessing Italian citizenship for people abroad who could prove that they were descendants of Italian immigrants. In the new Italian immigration, there are different types of mobility: highly qualified workers, such researchers and professionals, together with less workers, less specialized workers, such those who find job in the restaurant sector, for example. The recent trend, however, indicates a greater incidence of the educated and highly trained population. In 2006, Italians abroad who had only a low educational qualification were 68% of the total, while in 2018 they had dropped to 41%. About 2018 data among Italians abroad, 29% held a bachelor or a doctoral degree, while 29% had a high school diploma as a qualification. Just to compare with general data on Italy, and obvious disproportion emerged. In the 2018, the total number of graduates in Italy corresponds to 4% of populations. It follows that those who emigrate, even though they are not necessarily all graduates, represent proportionally the most educated component of the population. In 2020, 44% of Italians living abroad are in Europe, and 40% in America. In Europe, especially in Germany and Switzerland. In America, especially in Argentina and Brazil. look at the growth in mobility to European countries, the destination that experienced the greatest increase between 2006 and 2020 are Germany, United Kingdom, Switzerland, and France. Compared to the past, the origins of the new Italian immigration, about the region of origins, reveal an important novelty. The regions of the Centre-Nord prevail in the statistics. More people live for foreign countries from the Centre-Nord than from the south of the country. In the new immigration, an important component is attributable to the people of foreign origin or second generation of immigrants in Italy who decide to leave the country. In Italy, in the last decade, political asylum is a critical question. We talk about immigration now. The progressive closure of borders to flows for work and the increase in movements related to the wars has affected the growth of asylum application. A deep-rooted criticism of the reception of refugees, not without racist connotations, has developed in public opinion. The increase in the flow of asylum seekers is related to the multiplication of war in Mediterranean and Middle East. Unable to access legal channels to travel, migrants have greatly increased the risks during their journeys to Europe, relying on criminal organization in the face of the closure of European policies. The number of deaths by sea in the Mediterranean and on the Balkan route by land has increased enormously. In recent years, Italy has experienced an overall decrease in immigration flows. In 2011, about 600,000 residence permits were still issued each year to non-European citizens, and this flow stabilized at 200,000 per year in the following years. The stabilization of flows is linked to the effects of the global economic crisis, which has made the prospect for immigration to Europe less attractive than the past. At the same time, the tightening of laws in all European countries has led to a paralysis of legal flows. There is a kind of war against legal immigration movements. In spite of a restriction on citizenship, the acquisition of Italian citizenship has progressively increased, amounting to 1 million in the last 20 years. You can see here new Italian citizenships to 2016. And the word of a new generation of foreign immigrants represents an extremely dynamic component of Italian society. In 2020, around 5 million or 5 million and 3,000 foreign immigrants live in Italy, and 5 million and half Italians live abroad. It is necessary to recognize the centrality of Italy's migratory pluralism, in my point of view. Italy, like Portugal, is an area where immigration, and internal migration over time have transformed the social, political, and economic reality, and have frequently contaminated each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Colucci. I also have a question for you, please. As it was already mentioned in this event, there was an influx of Italians towards Brazil. However, some data shows that regarding the speaking Portuguese countries, the Cape Verdean community is important in terms of numbers in Italy. Do you think there is a specific event in Italian history that have contributed to this migration picture in Italy?
I am not a researcher about this kind of migration. I think that there is a problem about the question of citizenship, because we don't know who is Brazilian and who is Italian. I think that this question of global moments of citizenships is a very important issue for migration studies. But now in Italy, there is not a big research about immigration from South American countries. There is research about African, about Asian, and I hope for the future that we can find also una risposta,
An answer.
Question. Okay.
Thank you very much for your kindness. And I would like right now to call our next speaker, Professor Patrícia Jerónimo, who is an associate professor at the Law School of the University of Minho in Braga, doctorate in law from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, director in law from the European University, director of the Research Center for Justice and Governance, JustGov, at University of Minho, director of studies of the Master Program in Human Rights at the University of Minho, regional coordinator for Portuguese-speaking countries for Global City, Robert Schumann Center for Advanced Studies, European University Institute, member of EU Citizen Project directed by CEPS, funded by the European Commission, national expert for Portugal, studied to support the preparation and impact assessment on a potential EU policy on consular protection, DG Just. And her presentation is entitled Integration Policies and Migrants' Rights in Comparative Perspective, the Cases of Portugal and Italy. Professor Jerónimo, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Emellin, for the introduction. Sorry that my bio was so long. Thank you, Davide and Hipácia, for the invitation to take part in this debate. I'm very honored to be here today, and I hope I can contribute to this excellent discussion so far. Of course, my topic is way too broad, way too ambitious, so I will narrow it down, and of course, it will also be a schematic presentation. I will look into the similarities between the two countries and also then focus on the differences. Some of the similarities have been already presented by my previous my panel colleagues, by Pedro and also Michele. The fact that the two countries are traditional emigration countries, which have vast diasporas with which they want to keep ties. This is an important feature, a common feature between the two countries. Of course, I mean, it goes without saying that, of course, Southern European countries, Latin countries with Catholicism as its main religious community. Of course, there are other commonalities derived from the fact that they take part in the same international organizations, and at the global and regional level, of course, they have similar international commitments in terms of human rights. Of course, there is the EU framework, which is admissible when the topic is migration, and which immediately circumscribes the scope, the human scope of our discussions. Because when we talk about immigration in the EU context and at national level, we are now mostly discussing third country nationals and not EU nationals, which have a special regime. So the discussions that I will have with you will, although some aspects my presentation will be applicable also to concern also EU citizens, but most issues in particular relating to integration are solely applicable to third country nationals. Okay, but so here are already some commonalities. We are talking about international commitments, the EU framework, historic experience as countries of emigration. Another point, so they are often referred to as new immigration countries. Of course, already pointed out before that they continue to be emigration countries. So they continue to have a large outgoing fluxes of migrants. And other commonalities have to do with their constitutional frameworks, of course, in close connection with the international commitments in terms of human rights. And so equality is a fundamental principle, non-discrimination is a fundamental principle in both legal systems. And in terms of the status of foreigners in the country, both countries, both constitutions, both the Italian and Portuguese constitution, explicitly state that they are entitled to an equivalent treatment vis-a-vis the citizens of the country. So, of course, there are exceptions, and political rights are a major exception in place. Although, of course, and this already brings me to the differences at the level of political rights, there is a major difference between Portugal and Italy, which concerns the eligibility at local elections that third country nationals from specific countries on the basis of reciprocity enjoy in Portugal and not in Italy. But I'll come back to this later. So let's continue with the commonalities. And of course, as a consequence of this constitutional framework, which has in any case been developed by constitutional courts in two countries, so with very interesting case law from the constitutional courts on what are the exceptions to the equivalency rule, what rights can be restricted to or kept for nationals and denied to third country nationals, to foreigners in general. So apart from that, or as a consequence of these general equality principle, then we have at ordinary legislation, especially the immigration acts in both countries, enshrined or developed this principle and explicitly recognize the right of legal immigrants to foreigners to education, health, work, social benefits, in general as in equal terms vis-a-vis nationals. And so we can say, and also both countries have, at least in the books, so I'm talking about the legal frameworks, okay, not, there is a lot of literature on how then this legal framework is applied in practice in both countries, how it is frustrated in practice in both countries. So, but looking at the law in the books, we have also in both countries mechanisms in place to fight discrimination on the basis of religion and race, ethnicity, etc. And we have and to not only fight, but also institutions, agent equality bodies to report discrimination to, right? And again, not surprisingly, the appraisal, or not the appraisal, so the assessment of how these equality bodies work by academics and also by international supervisory bodies is usually not very, let's say, positive. Still, the system is in place. The law, the legal framework as a whole, in general, can be, of course, improved. There are aspects that have been pointed out in the literature of improvements that need to be done into the legal framework. But we can say that both countries, let's say, pass muster in terms of enshrining into the law, immigration and associated legal acts, equality of treatment between foreigners, migrants, and nationals. Okay, so this is the let's say, very broad brush draft of presentation of the commonalities. Okay, of course, we can say, okay, the equality principle is very, very strong, very good sign. Actually, both countries score favorably, although Portugal more favorably than Italy, in international scores like MyPacs. So they, the situation is not bad from the legal law in the books perspective. Of course, access to rights, irrespective of bureaucratic hurdles and other complications, access to rights is dependent for third country nationals, for foreigners in general, on presence in the territory, on stability of the right to stay in the territory and not be kicked out. And so, because of course, the right not to be kicked out is a sole prerogative of nationals. And so even privileged foreigners as EU citizens, they can, in of course, dire or extreme situations, but they can ultimately be kicked out of the EU member state of which they are not national. So it's a very strong difference and very important difference between nationals and foreigners. That, of course, you can say that there is a principle of equal treatment between foreigners and nationals, but of course the foreigners can only enjoy. Assuming that the system actually works, we can only enjoy the rights if they are allowed to stay in the territory. And here there are some important differences between Italy and Portugal that I will look into now. Okay, so now I think I covered generally the main similarities between the two countries, looking a bit at the sociological context and looking at the legal, what's the legal standard or legal framework in place. Now, looking at the differences, of course, also starting by the sociological, and without trying, I mean, as a lawyer, of course, I'm stepping my toe in the other people's waters. But anyway, I don't know even if this is an expression, by the way. But anyway, of course, the main point would start by the migratory pressure that Portugal and Italy face. And of course, the numbers are very different. And I checked the IOM data database, and so my numbers are not exactly the same as Michele's, but what I gathered was that for Portugal, for the numbers for 2020, Portugal has 1 million foreign. So Portugal's international migrant stock, to use the language of the IOM, is 1 million, or was 1 million in mid-2020, whereas Italy's international migrant stock was 6.4 million. I would note, in any case, that if we look at the percentage of the foreign stock by reference to the national population, the percentage is not that different, because for Portugal it's 9.8%, whereas for Italy it's 10.6%. This helps me to make one first point in the comparison, is that, of course, when we look at how Portugal seems to be so friendly or migrant friendly, and the good reviews in international indicators like MyPacs seem to confirm this, that Portugal is very migrant friendly. One explanation can be that the numbers are so much lower than in other countries, such as Italy and Spain. However, in terms of percentage of the population, then the difference is not as stark. So, of course, numbers help us explain some differences, but are not the sole explanation. And this leads me to another point of the stark contrast between Portugal and Italy, at least until now, in the past years, which is the politicization of migration, which is almost absent in Portugal. I mean, at the level of the political discourse. And here, when I'm talking about how elections are made on the basis, are won or lost on the basis of the party's platform on immigration issues, right? So this is very clearly the case in Italy, not the case in Portugal, at least so far. So we have now a parliamentary representation of a let's say right-wing party or extreme right-wing party, and although of course it mingles into its agenda manifesto, it means a lot of these ideas that are common to other right-wing, extreme right-wing parties in Europe, but immigration is not a key aspect of these parties' agenda. So other common tropes are present, but not so much immigration. And definitely, I would say, so far, it doesn't mean that it will not change, but so far, the elections in Portugal are not decided on the basis of how parties stand on the issue of immigration. And also another issue related to, which is not indifferent to this situation, is how Islam is perceived as a problem in Italy, clearly an integration issue. Many voices have been heard in Italy already from more than 2 decades about the inability and unwillingness of Muslims to integrate into Italian society, and how this is a huge problem that has to be faced. Whereas in Portugal, there is almost no sign of the use of Muslim integration as an integration issue, as a reason why restriction of access to the Portuguese territory must be implemented, or new restrictions must be implemented. So it's almost a non-issue. It can be considered, and it has been pointed out in the literature in Portugal. I'm thinking of Nina Clara Tisler, for instance, her work, which points out that this is not necessarily just such a good thing. It may be a sign of invisibility. And that doesn't mean that life is well in Portugal for Muslims, but or not necessarily. But it's important to note that indeed, in terms of the political use of immigration as in general, and Muslim immigration in particular, is starkly different in the two countries. And of course, it also has to do, of course, in Italy, there is a large community of Moroccan with a traditional immigration from Morocco, which is not so much the case in Portugal. Portugal, it was already mentioned by Pedro earlier that, of course, we have our immigration is very much a post-colonial, let's use it with between the commas, but from Brazil, from Cape Verde, other Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. So, which actually explains why for many years the Portuguese authorities didn't feel that they needed to implement or even devise an integration strategy, because it was assumed that there were no integration problems because the immigrants, the newly arrived immigrants, already knew the culture, already familiar with the culture, so had no need to assistance for assistance in language, learning, and so on. That has changed also because the countries of origin of immigrants in Portugal, as in Italy, have diversified. But I would say that in Italy, the diversity was always there from the start, whereas in Portugal, it became a feature much more recently, much later on. Okay, so so these two or 3 points, if we include here this difference in terms of countries of origin, already mentioned. Now about the law. Okay, so the main differences, I will point to the nationality law and the immigration law. If we look at conditions for integration, I don't know how many minutes I have. I hope I still have 5 minutes or not.
2, let's say.
Oh, okay. So yeah, oh, that's okay. So Nationality Act, the Portuguese Nationality Act, is praised by MyPax, among others, has a world-leading citizenship model. Why? Because it's very easy to access Portuguese citizenship. The law has been moving, so the criteria for attribution of citizenship at birth have been made more and more open. So with the adoption of W Soli in 2006, and more recently with a very short period of time of legal residence in the country to, or even just legal residence, and if not legal residence, just 1 year of residence of one of the parents at time of birth. So it's very easy to access citizenship at birth by the children of immigrants, or third country nationals, or EU citizens. It doesn't matter. Also, in terms of naturalization, the let's say, the residence requirement is the half for general naturalization, so it's 5 years as opposed to 10 years in Italy, and the language requirement is also lower in Portugal, is a A2 level, whereas in Italy is B1 level. Something which has been the language requirement in Italy has been criticized, including by MyPax, as something which makes access to citizenship quite more difficult. Okay, so there is also a difference which is significant. In Portuguese Nationality Act only allows for loss of citizenship by renunciation. So only if a person wants to lose it, except for cases of fraud, of course. Whereas in Italy, there are cases of involuntary loss on the traditional grounds of criminality and rendering of services to foreign states, etc. So these are the most important differences in terms of nationality. And why do I mention these here? This has already been also addressed. The nationality, the acquisition of the nationality of the country of destination, let's say, of immigration, it's usually viewed as the final step in the integration process. And so the conditions that countries offer to foreigners to access their nationality are viewed as a sign of openness, of migrant friendliness or not. Okay, just I know that I'm abusing my time, but just to look at the integration. Again, we have very different situations in the two countries. For a third country national to obtain a residence permit, a temporary residence permit, he has to, of course, fill in a few requirements, but no integration requirement at this point. So there is only one integration requirement when there is a request for a permanent residence. So after 5 years residence, the integration requirement is only proficiency in Portuguese at A2 level. So it's not really proficiency, is not basic knowledge of Portuguese. Whereas in Italy, we have this much discussed, much commented on integration agreement, which is required from third country nationals. There are a few exceptions, but most third country nationals have to sign this agreement with the state, with the Italian state, at the time of the first request for a residence permit of 1 year or more. And so, and this agreement includes a number of credits, which require that to meet the credits required to obtain a renewal of the residence permit and to avoid being expelled from the country. These credits involved adherence to the values of the country, learning Italian, and a number of other participation in integration, civic integration courses, etc. I could not find in my research for this presentation data on how many third country nationals have been expelled following the negative review of these, the fulfillment of these integration agreements. And I can say that although it looks like Portugal is so much more migrant friendly and Italy is so much more restrictive, the fact is this, and one of the aspects is indeed that this integration agreement introduced into, which started to be applied in 2012. The fact is that international bodies, supervisory bodies such as ASCIP, have assessed positively this mechanism of integration. Although, of course, I could not find, and you may tell me if there are numbers of how many people were expelled on the basis of this. That will also give us an idea of how efficient and how problematic it may be for the stability and the rights of third country nationals in Italy. And thank you for the tolerance, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really complete framework that you did. Thank you. At least for me, who was from the law, also, it was quite complete. Thank you very much. So also, I do have a question, and it's quite a tricky one. So feel free to answer as you wish. So considering that an international migrant would be the one who crosses an internationally recognized border, my question is, how could law and maybe the legal studies in general, treat or even help to develop a treatment to protect the rights of international migrant students who are blocked right now in their country of origin due to the historical pandemic situation that you are living and pass through right now? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack there. So because of course the pandemic situation brings to the fore the let's say the safeguards that are in place for the states, safeguards for the states to block entry and to restrict entrance to their territories on the basis of public health, right? So that's one issue. So indeed, states are allowed to deny entry to non-nationals on grounds of public health concerns. So that's one issue. Because looking at the students in particular, I would say that especially at high, more qualified students, at university students, I would say that in principle they are welcome by countries of destination. Because there is this, let's say, fast tracks for students because they are considered to be transient and also easy to integrate in principle easy to integrate in the countries of destination due to their high qualifications. So, but of course, I'm totally aware of the difficulties, the obstacles that students face. I'm particularly familiar with the situation of Brazilian students who, for the past years, have been constantly arriving late at start of the academic year because they have problems with visas. This has more to do with not so much the willingness of the countries of destination to accept these students. I think it's more a practical issue, right? So, but we can discuss. So I think that it's not so much, from my view, not so much a question of oh, we don't want this kind of migrants. So I mean, among the all the motivations around for crossing international borders, I would say that students, highly skilled foreigners are welcome. Also because they pay tuition, also because they pay higher tuition than the nationals for good reasons. I'm not going to discuss that, but still. So I would not say that it's a principal issue. It's more a bureaucratic issue, which is actually one of the main. So we can have very good laws, immigration, constitutional, at the constitutional level, at so ordinary legislation level. We can have very nice egalitarian legal frameworks, and then of course it all is hindered by how the laws are applied. I don't know if I addressed your concerns. I'm afraid I didn't, but still, so this is my take on it to start with. Thank you for your question anyway.
Thank you, and you did. Thank you very much. So right now I open to the audience, a kind of Q&A period. So let me see just if you have any question or...
I actually would have a question. I don't know. I will give space first to the audience if there is any question from the audience. Otherwise, I will ask a question directly to Patrícia.
You can go on, then I can check.
So just a curiosity, I'm not an expert on law, so I'm more on the biophysical, like, kind of branch of science, right? So do you see like the possibility to have a unification of the rights of migration rights across the Mediterranean basin and the Atlantic basin? Is there any, especially in South America and Europe?
Well, via the let's say, again, this term, which is quite charged, but this post-colonial ties. So there are some special statuses for instance, for foreigners coming from former colonies, right? So that's the case in Portugal. That's the case also in Spain. As for a unification, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what would be the outcome of such, because it would have to be based in an international agreement of the countries, and there are already some minimum common denominators in terms of rights, actually many promoted by the EU or within the EU, and also of course related to the Council of Europe instruments. So I believe you are making the connection with the former colonies.
Yes.
And that already exists, but not uniformly, of course. So Portugal thinks about its ties with its former colonies, so Brazil, the African Portuguese-speaking countries, and also Timor-Leste, and it has indeed some access. Actually, I promised to talk about political access to political rights, and then I forgot. I'm sorry, but that's okay. So they have not all, because there is a condition of reciprocity, but Brazilians and Cape Verdeans can vote and be elected in local elections in Portugal, for instance. And so I'm not positive about how it is in Spain, how extensive are the rights that are accorded by Spanish law to third country nationals coming from Latin American countries. But I would not be surprised if there were also some perks of being a national.
What I wanted to know was more like so understanding your feeling as an expert, so whether we are going towards inclusion or like a more solid borders, so whether like the tendency is actually uniforming, opening up, or whether there is a discussion about this, or if it's more static, the situation is more static with rigid limitations.
Well, the easy answer is that is very complex. So we have signs in all directions. So we have, on the one hand, signs of openness. For instance, the countries are more open to accept dual citizenship. I didn't mention this earlier. Actually, both Portugal and Italy accept dual citizenship, which is viewed as a sign of willingness to integrate foreigners, because if they can naturalize while keeping their citizenship of origin, that will make their lives easier. There are, well, the international human rights movement is a form of opening rights to, and there have been many developments at the global UN level and also at regional level, so within the Council of Europe, within the European Union. So, and of course, there has been an effort, and there has been progress towards making rights predictable, making the status of third country nationals predictable. For instance, a directive already from 2004, I believe, or 2003, regarding precisely the status of long-term third country nationals in the EU, right? And so those who have more permanent presence in the territory of one EU member state, and then if they have a permanent residence permit, they can then almost at least circulate within the EU as if they were EU citizens. Of course, the equivalence is not total, but still, so there have been many developments towards more inclusive societies, right? So there have been a widening of the rights which are recognized and granted, at least in theory, to foreigners on a par or tentative equality with national citizens, but the times are not favorable to human rights, right? So it's the human rights discourse itself is considered to be often decried as PC, so politically correct mumbo jumbo, and or ideologically too charged to be really applicable or useful for political discussions. And there is a clear anti-immigration sentiment in many parts. Of course, now we're in this weird situation in which borders are back strongly with the pretext, which is not a bad pretext, of the global pandemic, right? So I would say that there have been many developed. So, okay, the glass half full kind of answer. Okay, we have had positive developments, many of which with the EU has very bad press, but it has led to many good things, and has contributed to, let's say, fight some of the member states' most, let's say, nationalist impulses at times. But there are many things to be done, and there are, trends and counter trends, and so some developments in one way and then counter developments in another way. Actually, I can say that Portugal, with its Nationality Act, it's very much counter-trend in Europe, because many countries are discussing ways to make access to citizenship much harder, whereas Portugal is making it easier. So that's why it's praised by MyPax and others as a world-leading model, because it makes access to citizenship easier. But the discussions are very complex, sorry.
Thank you.
And thank you. Right now you have a question from the audience, but before that, I would like just to address a question to Professor Guido, if I can, because as you are talking about this integration assessment, and it's kind of, you have a kind of format of an Italian, of a Portuguese that you have to follow in order to say if a person is integrated or not to some kind of culture, some kind of society. So my question is, do you think from the DNA, could you say that someone is Italian, 100% Italian, 100% Portuguese, so you can say that that person can be integrated or not? Because right now with the migration, maybe you don't have the same DNA that you can count some couple of million years ago. So thank you very much. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Now, first of all, we are not biologically equal. We are different. And if you look at someone whose origin you don't know, sometimes you can approximately place this unknown person on the map, more or less, spot the continent. This is not always true. It's not always true, because the world is not black and white as some in Europe believe. But certainly there is a biological basis to our differences. Now, from the genetic standpoint, these differences affect 1 part over 1,000 of our genome. So we are remarkably similar to one another. But this doesn't mean that we are equal. So if you are a carrier of some peculiar DNA features, you can place a person very precisely on the map, especially if this person is a carrier of a disease, because genetic diseases have a localized distribution. But if you know that someone is 0 blood group, for instance, O blood group, then this person can come from any continent in the world. The reason why biological anthropology has abandoned the concept of race is not for political reasons, but it's simply because through that lens, the lens of classification of people in homogeneous groups, each different from one another, you don't understand what is really important to understand. So the nature of our differences and the way they evolved. So people who are into this field has completely lost the habit to label people in 5, 6, 7 broad categories. This doesn't work. We focus on individual differences, but this does not mean that we are all equal. Actually, the reason why people like me are paid to study evolution is because there is enough variation to allow us to reconstruct migration phenomena or the composition of the ancestral composition of populations. Is this an answer to what you asked?
It is a perfect answer to my question.
I would have a follow-up, if possible. So you actually, okay, so if my understanding is correct, so you explained us today that we are the product of a massive, or multiple massive phenomena of migrations. And then we also heard from Professor Góis and Professor Colucci that there is so in our specific countries, so in Portugal and in Italy, there were a massive phenomenon of migration inside and outside, so with different waves, and we have the need to regulate. So we are a product of migration, okay? So from thousands of years and in modern times. All right, so this, it seems clear. So you all said this. And it seems also clear that actually so the more we are connected, the more we learn. And actually, you have to know, I spent long years in Germany, almost I lived a decade in Germany. And once in a newspaper in Germany, they were asserting, the journalist was saying that it was reporting that a modern person learn more today reading a page of a newspaper than he could in an entire lifetime 50 years ago. Now, this is not a scientific information, so I don't know how much is true, but it's certainly true that through the networking, internet, even this webinar that we are having today and this evening, like in these 2 hours, we learned so many things together, right? From 4 different topics. So from diversity and connections, we all learn, and this is simply an observation without any judgment. But in spite of this, we are afraid. So there are people that are so politically afraid. So there are there must be regulations and so on. So I would like to ask you to explain or discuss whether there is an historical background, either from the evolutionary point of view or the social point of view, that is at the origin of our fear.
Well, I am a bit reluctant to venture into fields that are not my fields of expertise, especially in this phase of pandemics, in which people who are expert in one field speak of all the fields of the universe and spread stupid ideas. But I will try to refer to something I've read. So mind you, I'm not speaking of my own business here. I'm referring to something I read. Mm-hmm. There is reason to believe that in the brutal world in which our ancestors evolved, being able to recognize a potential friend and a potential enemy made all the difference between living and dying. So chances are that we developed within our brain, within our cognitive functions, a very fast and superficial system to divide the world into us and them. This is reflected also in very sophisticated systems of thought. Think about classical Greece, 5th century before Christ. The world was divided into Greeks and barbarians. That was the way they looked at them. And this is typical of many cultures, us and them. The Bribri of Costa Rica divide the world in Bribri, the man, them, and the Nya, who also means shit, and are the other people. Now, we evolved in this world, but also we live in the very interconnected world that you mentioned. And so my feeling is that our task now is to move from prejudice to judgment. I mean, all these fast systems of classification of people are based on prejudice, and prejudice is not always a bad thing because it may help us in very difficult conditions. But at a certain moment, it's our task to move from prejudice to a judgment of the people we have in front of us and an attempt to interact with these people, right?
Thank you, fantastic. And what about Professor Góis and Professor Colucci? Would you like to elaborate on this?
No,
Please. Okay.
Please.
So Professor Góis, so then let's start with you. So we do one Italian and one Portuguese in an alternate correct manner.
So I fully agree, and I've really learned a lot this afternoon. What I wanted to ask, if I may, to put a question myself to our colleague Guido, is what about the contemporary mass migration? Because if you are studying, for instance, the Brazilian population on a pre-colonial times, they were indigenous living in the continent with no contact or very few contacts with the Europeans. And suddenly, and this means in the last 4 to 5 centuries, there was this movement of new genes coming from Africa, coming from Europe, coming from elsewhere to Brazil, making something that was non-existent at the time. Was this change anything in our genomes? So my question is to be directly, are the Brazilians mixed of individuals different from Europeans, or we are all the same? Because this, even the massive migrations make any difference.
Yeah. So if I may answer right away, of course, they are different from the way they were 4 centuries ago. And we can even spot within their DNA, sometimes, not always, something telling us about their origins. For instance, we know that in Brazil, the Y chromosomes transmitted by males are largely European, whereas a part of the genome, the mitochondrial DNA, which is transmitted by women to all of their children, have a larger component of local native people and Africans. So all these things are possible. There are two different perspectives. From the health standpoint, people who are in medical research consider the populations as they are now, with the risk and their, their situation after admixture. People like me who are into evolution, reconstruction of history, try to take samples of populations unaffected or poorly affected by recent migration in order to have a view on what happened before the Europeans colonized the Americas.
Thank you. Because, well, recently, 2019, because 2020 was a non-existent year for all of us, I was in Brazil. And I've been in Amazonia and dealing with one indigenous group of people that had very, very reduced contact with Europeans or colonizers. And so they are now, that since then I'm following their stories, they are more affected than normal current Brazilians for the pandemic, but also from other disease. And this is 21st century. It's not the 16th century anymore. So thank you.
Thank you, but I have to add that I am from Amapá, so I stayed in the borders between Brazil and France, so I can confirm that things happen there, unfortunately. But I still have a question from the audience, so I would like to address this question to Professor Pedro Góis and Professor Colucci. So I'd like to ask about the impact of the climate crisis on migration in the future. Is it understood? Are you prepared? So what do you think?
Yes, this is a new issue in last 10 years in Mediterranean area and also in Italy. There are very big environmental question about climatic and environmental migrations. There are a lot of kind of environmental migrations, also in internal migrations in South Europe, perhaps in the future. There are a big question about the water, especially in Africa, especially in Asia. A big question about the global warming, and in this period in Italy we are discussing about refugee of environmental crisis, but we do not apply the refugee status for environmental question. This is a big problem. Is a big problem in our law in this period.
If I can add something, we are prepared. We are prepared because in the past, like we have learned, people were moving, and maybe some of those big mass migrations were due because of climate change at the time. So they moved because they needed to move. So we are, of course, prepared. What we are not prepared is to deal with those migrations without conflict. Maybe we never were prepared in the past. So there will be some social conflicts, so some political conflicts, but people will move. They have no other option in some cases, that the option is to move or to die. So they will try to move, and this will generate conflicts, and we will deal with the conflicts, and as humanity we will survive, and our genes will survive. That is for sure. Maybe some politicians won't survive, but that's not too bad, I think.
Wonderful. So with this wonderful statement, I would like to ask you if you have final considerations, if you'd like to add something, because after that we have to close, unfortunately, because I'm enjoying that much this conversation. So I've just passed the floor to you in order to make maybe final considerations. So Professor Guido Barbujani.
I said all that I had to say. I learned a lot of things, so thank you for inviting me, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Professor Pedro Góis.
Thank you very much for allowing me to join this conversation. I think this has shown to the world that when scientists coming from different disciplines, they bring some different themes to the conversation. We still can have a dialogue and to learn one from each other, and that's the result of what we are doing in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Colucci.
I was pleased to meet you, and I hope see you in Portugal.
You also hope that. Professor Jerónimo, thank you.
Thank you. I totally agree with my colleagues. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot this afternoon. So thank you again, Hipácia, for inviting me. And well, count me in for future initiatives of this kind. These are very, very nice multi or interdisciplinary dialogues. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Davide, I don't know if you want to close.
Thank you, everybody, again. So thank you for all the people that followed us. But thank you especially to you guys, like Patrícia, Pedro, Guido, and Michele, so to give us the possibility to really learn and understand more and develop our critical thinking. Thank you very much, and see you all soon.
Let's hope so. Bye.
Thank
Bye
you
bye.
to all of you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.